Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion, as you tell from the title up there, continuing my trek through the films that were released by Disney starting in the late 80s and ending in the late 90s. This, of course, is the period known as the Disney Renaissance. We are almost at the end of this review series. We're on the penultimate film, one of the ones I did see in theaters, and I've loved it ever since it came out. It, of course, is the 1998 animated film Mulan, directed by Barry Cook and Tony Bancroft. It was made for $90 million. Of course, it's $90 million in 90s money. And it made $304.3 million, so definitely made some money. But as I brought up multiple times before, you can start to notice the downward trend when it comes to the returns on investment. And part of that might be the fact that it's now a yearly thing instead of longer gaps. So starting to come back to it. And of course, it features the voice talent of Ming-Na Wen as Mulan, Eddie Murphy as Mushu, BD Wong as Captain Shang. You got Harvey Fierstein as Yao, Jerry Tondo as Po, James Hong as Shifu. Miguel Ferrer as Shan Yu. June Foray as Grandma Fa. The legendary George Takei as the first ancestor. The equally legendary Pat Morita as the Emperor, and forgive me if I mispronounce this name, Sun Tek-o as Fa Zhou. Now, the beginning of this film, like some of the other ones, we go back towards the beginning of the Renaissance. Because the studio that did this film's animation was Walt Disney Feature Animation in Florida, which opened up in 1989, my birth year. And it opened with 40 to 50 employees. They were originally created to create shorts and features. In 1993, following their assistance on Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and Lion King, the executives allowed the studio to create their first feature. Which they probably looked at the work that they did on those specific films. Like, you guys are doing good there. You guys showing you guys can do it. So you can take lead on one. And of course, the people at the studio took an interest in Asian-themed legends because so far, we got a lot of European legends. With Pocahontas, we're going with more American ones. And of course, with Lion King showing that you could look outside the box and go with some inspiration that's going to really surprise people with African influence there. So it's like, yeah, let's go to Asia. Now, two projects that they had were combined. One was a short called China Doll, and if there's anyone that takes any offense at that, I apologize. About a Chinese girl who's whisked away by a British Prince Charming, and one based on the poem, The Song of Fa Mulan. That first one, I really think that if they had made that one just based with that title and with its premise, it probably would have been a failure by comparison. Different name, it might have worked, but it would have probably been seen as by the note for Disney. But so taking some of that elements and combining it with a Mulan-based story definitely was a better idea. Now, following the Roger Rabbit short Trail Mix-Up, which I have no opinion about because I have never seen any of the Roger Rabbit shorts, director Barry Cook, he had lunch with Thomas Schumach, I'm going to butcher this name, Schumacher, and was offered two projects, A Scottish Tale with Dragons and Mulan. Now, he suggested adding the dragon to Mulan due to their presence in Chinese legends, and of course because of that we get the character of Mushu, and he was given the director's job. Now, Bancroft was added as co-director following a recommendation from Bob Minkoff, who was the Lion King co-director. And these two actually mesh well. In 1994, the artistic supervisors went to China for 3 weeks to take photographs and drawings of landmarks for inspiration, which, of course, as I brought up before on my Hunchback of Notre Dame video, is a good thing to do because then you got all that reference point and the background stuff and the architecture. It's going to make it all the more believable. And just from an animation standpoint, a lot of the backgrounds, the design, the look of China, whether it's the Great Wall, the city, the villages, or even the landscaping, it really feels authentic. And granted, I'm saying that never having been to China, but just from the photos and videos I've seen of it, it does look authentic. So. Now, in its earliest stages, the story was a Tootsie-inspired romantic comedy where Mulan is a misfit tomboy who loves her father, is betrothed to Shang, even though she hasn't met him, and runs away after shattering a stone in which her father carved her destiny. Now, that would have been an interesting film, but it probably would have gotten the same type of result that China Doll would have. They would have looked at it and been like, oh, it's by the book and all that. Probably some of the fringe people would have been like, oh, this is feminist propaganda. And probably some people watching it for the first time now would be saying that. And it just doesn't have the same spark. Particularly the whole thing with Shang. It is a romance in the final film, but it's a more subtle one to where it doesn't become an obvious romance until the third act. And there it's very subtle. It's more the sequel that really makes it more overt. It's one where you can see it blossoming into a full one, but there's enough there to where it's more subtextual. So being like that, like, Now the betrothal thing, I'm not really going to cast a stone on that without actually researching the history in depth, but I can kind of see it just from what little I know. The romantic comedy aspect, we've had a lot of romantic comedies. It would have been interesting maybe to see Disney try one, but this might not be the right story for that approach. Especially considering something I'll bring up about the musical aspect of the film. Now, Shattering the Stone, that could have been interesting, but then that would take away the epic scene where Mulan makes her decision in the final film. Now, sorry about that. Oh yeah, Chris Sanders, he was a story supervisor, one of the guys that wrote the screenplay, and he also later would co-direct Lilo and Stitch. He also did the writing with Raymond Singer. Now, the reason I bring him up is because he was hoping to work on Hunchback around this time, but he was appointed as the Mulan story head. And of course, that romantic comedy aspect I just brought up, he grew frustrated with that and urged a more faithful adaptation of the legend. And of course, the hair sequence that I brought up, that served as a pivotal moment in the evolution of her character, and he was really pushing for that. And of course, apparently there was a song in earlier ones, and it just became minimal dialogue. And it's one of those things where just letting the visuals tell most of the story, I think, makes it a little bit stronger. Because if that was a song, for a film, it might not work. On stage in a musical adaptation for Broadway, yeah, definitely could. But you could also just have it be silent there too, but definitely works better for film. Another little changes in the original draft, General Li and Shang were not father and son. But of course the story changes. They become a mirror to Mulan and her own father. That whole expectation of fathers on their children based on their gender or their place in society and all that. And there's a nice little compare and contrast between them. And I think that's why, with how much the romance actually built up in the final film, that Shang and Mulan work as a couple there because they got that little thing. Now, one thing that the Bancroft declined to explore was Buddhism, and that was due to his Christian beliefs. Now, there's a little bit to say there, which I get it, but at the same time, it's one of those things like, yeah, you're not the only religion in town, buddy. Now, how exploring Buddhism in the final film would have impacted it, I don't know. They do kind of touch a little bit on Eastern religion and the whole shrine for the ancestors thing, but they don't fully touch on it. It's kind of like how for Aladdin they kind of touch a little bit on Middle Eastern religion because, they mention Allah by name, but they never really go there. And it's one of those things that's not really needed. So he probably could have gone more on and said that instead of pointing out his own religion thing, but it is what it is. Now, the plot of the film, since I got the little backstory part out of the way, is that it is based on the legend of Fa Mulan, a lady in ancient China who took her father's place during a war, disguised herself as a man, led troops, and was victorious. Now, in the original legend, or at least the versions that I've heard of it, it wasn't until years later where she revealed that she was a man. Now, I've heard there's different endings to it, like one's a more happy ending, the other one's a more dark ending. I think it probably depends on what source you're looking at. Here, obviously, since it's Disney, they're going to go more with the more upbeat ending, so there is that. The specific plot for this adaptation of that story is the Huns are invading China. That's the opening scene where they scale the Great Wall of China. We're introduced right away to our villain, Shan Yu, and he climbs there. And of course, the often quoted line that's been memed as well. Now all of China knows you're here. And he really loves it because he wants all of China to know he's here because he wants the challenge. The emperor hears it and he tells the military, specifically his general, hey, get as many soldiers as you can. Conscription. We will defend China. We will defend my people. And of course, the word goes out and the draft begins. Now, as this is going on, Mulan is of age and it's time for her to be betrothed. So she's being sent to the matchmaker. Now, as we see right away, she is not the typical Chinese woman. Now, they never really give a time period for when this film is supposed to be set other than vague ancient China. You can kind of get a vague idea based on the fact we see the Great Wall, they're mentioning the Huns, but they never narrow it down. It's kind of like with a lot of their other fairy tale inspired ones where you see some of the influence in the designs, but it's never given a clear one, so you just have that, once upon a time thing. So it's kind of the same thing there. It's just vague ancient China, which, given the fact it's based off a legend, makes a little sense. Now, that said, even with that, she's a little different, more independent minded. Obviously, from what we see, doesn't really like kowtowing, even though she will at times, as we see. But it's more out of respect for her father, as we'll see following the scene. And of course, this growing farm, she's a little bit of a tomboy, or as much as a tomboy as one could be in an ancient Chinese setting. Now, her father is really praying to the ancestors that she impresses the matchmaker, and as we see when the chickens run in, please, please help her. That really tells you all you need to know. And of course, her mother and grandmother are really getting her ready for the matchmaker. And it does not go well. Everything goes boom, which of course leads into Mulan's song that really sets up her whole character arc, and that is Reflection. It's like she's not going to make a perfect bride or perfect daughter. She's playing a part, and it's a lovely song. And of course, it's the song that's from the songs that are actually in the film proper. It's the one that got adapted into the end credits song, and it's the song that introduced the world at large to Christina Aguilera. And that song, her version of it, is still excellent. The way she just belts out the "Who is that girl I see?" and then of course the "Who I am inside" thing. Even now, it's like, yeah, she really kills that song. I mean, she kills it so much that when they did the live-action remake of this film, they had her come back and re-record a new version of it. That should tell you. Now, Mulan and her father do have a brief little moment before the Emperor's aide shows up with the whole draft thing, and she essentially embarrasses her father in front of everybody. And of course, it leads to them having a little argument, and of course, him putting his foot down. "I know my place, it's time you learned yours." And this leads to the big moment in the rain where Mulan makes her decision. Like, perfect visual storytelling, the music, which I haven't brought up the actual score, which is done by Jerry Goldsmith, the legendary film composer. And if there's any moment that really brings up his score, it is that moment. Just the way, the beat of it and all that, combined with the visuals. And do the whole thing, she prays because she's made her decision. She cuts her hair, which, given the context of what she's doing, is her stripping away her femininity. And of course, putting on the armor, she's getting rid of her femininity and accepting masculinity. And of course, to add to this, when she steals her father's scroll, which I guess you could say is a sign of masculinity, she leaves her comb that she would put in her hair right in its place, leaving her a sign of femininity. And of course, once they realize she's gone, that's the first thing he finds is that. And to add to it, if she is discovered, the penalty will be death. And that's the reason her father doesn't follow, because he knows if he outs his daughter, she's going to be killed on sight. So everybody prays to the ancestors, especially the grandmother, who the first time we heard her mention of praying to the ancestors in front of her, she's like, what kind of help can they be? They're dead. So her praying to him wakes him up, and this, of course, would be the first ancestor, the ancestor meeting. And they originally wanted to send the Great Stone Dragon, but Mushu a former guardian messes that up, so he decides to go instead, taking along his lucky cricket buddy. And they are essentially trying to help Mulan get into the military training and save China. Now, at first things do not go well. Of course, does not really make friends with her fellow soldiers off the bat, and there's a lot of there's a misunderstanding, which leads to a big old brawl, and of course leads to her having an awkward first encounter with Captain Shang. And of course, the next day we get the beginning of the training montage set to Make a Man Out of You, probably, other than Reflection, probably the best one. Let me restart it. The most well-known song from the film. And perfect way to do a training montage. And of course, by the end, they're all ready. And the way that Mulan, in the course of that song, figures out, how to get the arrow with discipline and strength. She's like, uses it, ties them together, and then climbs up there, and she gets the arrow. And this, of course, is after Shang has said, yeah, you're not cutting the mustard, as it were. And, like I mentioned, the whole thing with the musical a little bit earlier. The musical numbers in this film are only in the first half of it. I mean, there's Reflection, there is the musical number where they're getting Mulan ready for the matchmaker. There, of course, like I said, Make a Man Out of You. Then there is the song as they're marching to go find the rest of the army, about a girl worth fighting for. And once that song ends, there's no more musical numbers for the rest of it. And part of that is the song gets cut off by them finding the remains of a village and then the remains of the Chinese army, or at least the main army, that was massacred by the Huns. And at this point, the film kind of has a little bit of a tone shift. It's not fully, because there is still some moments where you definitely tell it's still a Disney movie. But the filmmakers have enough of that self-awareness to know that once they cross this threshold with the story, especially since it's seen through the eyes of the recruits, and especially Mulan, you kind of have to pull back a little bit on the musical numbers. In a stage version, you can get away with that a little bit more, but on film, you got to pull back a little bit more. And of course, the Hun army eventually does get taken out, but it's not over, which leads to a climax in the Imperial city, and a lot of good moments there too. And that's where we get another little cross-dressing moment, which really shows that in the course of everything they've been through, that a lot of the people in what's left of the Chinese army, especially her three buddies, Po, Shifu, and Yao, they trust Mulan with their lives, and they're going to go along with her plan. Now, I don't really want to spoil all of it for those who haven't seen it, so that's why I'm being a little vague with that. It makes for a fitting climax for the film. And like I said, of course, the lack of musical numbers enhances that. Now, the other song from the movie is, of course, the team-up of 98 Degrees, the boy band, and Stevie Wonder, which is a very weird musical team-up, and I want to see more weird musical team-ups like this, because I like them. And, of course, the song True to Your Heart, perfect song. Now, if there's anything I have to really come close to lambasting this film over, it would probably be that even though he has presence, Shan Yu is not the best Disney villain. I mean, it's whether you're looking at it just as the Renaissance or just looking at it in the big picture, he's not the best villain. He doesn't have a lot of depth to him. He's essentially just an invader leader, a Hun leader. That's essentially where his characterization ends and begins. Now, for the plot of this specific film, it works. And it's an example of a lack of deep writing is balanced out by an excellent character design, even though they kind of designed him in a way where it's kind of implying he might be subhuman, as a fact of giving the yellow eyes and all that. But it also makes him seem a little bit, like I said, inhuman, but also makes it seem a little bit more monstrous in the fact that he's going to massacre people. And, of course, the presence that Miguel Ferrer brings to him with his performance. He never really oversells it. Even the moments where his character is mad, he just gives it the right amount of volume, right amount of gravitas to it, and that really fits for this character. But like I said, it's like when you compare him to other villains, like if you're looking at it from the wide scope of it, comparing it to like Maleficent, comparing it to like the Queen from Snow White, even though she kind of goes into the same boat, but since it's his first film, kind of gets a pass. Ratigan, and then of course from the Renaissance, you know, you got Ursula, you got Gaston. After this, you're gonna have Clayton, and before this, of course, you had Frollo. It's only by comparison that he's not the best villain. For the story, he works though. But if there's anything I gotta bring up, it goes with that. Now, how the film was received. Like I mentioned, it did make money when it was released. This is what Rotten Tomatoes has to say. Exploring themes of family, duty, and honor, Mulan breaks new ground as a Disney film while still bringing vibrant animation and sprightly characters to the screen. I think I probably typoed that. And this is what other people had to say. This is what Siskel said. A big disappointment when compared with the studio's other recent films about a female hero searching for independence. Design of the film does not take advantage of the inspiration provided by classic Chinese artists, and the songs are not memorable. I've brought it up multiple times that there's a reason I'm not a big fan of Siskel and Ebert. It's when they say crap like that. And that shows, in retrospect, that they are wrong. Of course, James Bertadelli of the Real Views had this to say. Adults will appreciate the depth of characterization, while the kids will love Mulan's sidekick, a colorful dragon named Mushu. Everyone will be entertained by the fast-moving plot and rich animation. That one, I think, kind of sums up how I appreciate the film. Is that as a kid, it was definitely a lot of the colorful stuff, the actiony stuff, you know, the songs. Of course, I did like Mulan as a character and all that. It's just more the in-depth stuff I appreciate more as I get older. It's like how I mentioned before with Beauty and the Beast and Hunchback, is that depth stuff is stuff I appreciate more as an adult. And I like that they put that stuff there because that's the stuff for the adults who are taking the kids to see these films. Now, I know one thing that some of you are probably wondering is like, how did they respond to the film in China? Apparently, one of the big complaints was that the film felt too westernized. They complained that Mulan looked too foreign-looking and the story was too different from the myths. Well, considering that that's myths plural and this is an adaptation, there is going to be differences there because, one, it's a Disney film, so obviously they're going to have to filter through that lens. And two, they're going to have to figure out how to adapt it. Like, if there's differences in, like, story beats from one myth to the other, they have to go with it. Like, obviously, the thing they're not going to do is have it to no one figures out Mulan is Mulan until way after whatever the war is. They could have done that, but it just doesn't work as well. I mean, there's a reason why, to bring up Lord of the Rings, why they kind of dropped the whole thing about Eowyn's disguise being a disguise that works in the book. It was not going to work so well in the film, unless you just never show that character until that moment. That's the only way that plot element will work. The too foreign-looking thing, looking at her, I'm like, I don't get it. I don't see what they're seeing with that. Are they expecting it to be really stylized to the point where someone's going to complain the other way? Because they could have done some of the drawings that way, make her look really Asian to the point where it becomes more of a caricature, but yeah, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation there. And of course, I've already brought up the whole thing with the villain design, so there's that. As for the westernized thing, of course it's going to be a little westernized. This is a film that's being adapted by Western filmmakers, mainly for a Western audience, but also for an abroad audience. It's going to always have that filter. And of course, I feel that they do dilute it respectfully through it. Now, part of that might also be because this is following the release of a certain film about the Dalai Lama called Kundun. And of course, apparently Disney hoped that this film might soothe over relations with the Chinese government that soured after that. especially since Disney was the ones that funded that. So some of that might still be there. Some of the whole political charge thing from there, so there is that. Now the more recent live action one, some of the changes I've heard about that and where it was filmed, that I get a little bit more than some of the complaints about that. Alright, and of course, now it is time for some interesting trivia. Apparently before they got Eddie Murphy to voice Mushu, they approached Joe Pesci and Richard Dreyfuss. Pesci would have been interesting just for the fact that he's in another kid's movie and it's a Disney movie nonetheless. I can just imagine that he would have probably ruined a bunch of takes with his cursing. But it would have been fun to hear him as Mushu. Richard Dreyfuss would have been interesting. It's kind of hard to picture him in the role unless the characterization is a little different. And of course, getting Eddie is perfect. And of course, this is before he voiced Donkey, though I believe he had already recorded some of the dialogue for that character at this point. And of course, this ended up being released first, so there's that. And he recorded his voice work in his Inglewood, New Jersey basement. And it doesn't really sound like it's recorded in a basement. Now, to create the 2,000 Hun soldiers that it's used during the Hun attack sequence, which is when they come down the snow-capped mountain in a charge, the production team developed crowd simulation software called Attila, and it allowed thousands of unique characters to move autonomously. Now, this is based, of course, on some of the work they've done in the previous films, like, it started with them combining 2D and 3D in Beauty and the Beast, and then, of course, the Stampede sequence in The Lion King, a lot of the stuff in Hunchback, and some of the stuff that I brought up before, and, of course, they also used a variety of this program later in the film for 3000 in the Imperial City. And it really does add to it. It makes it feel like there is an army charging down. And of course it cuts down on having to do each and every one of them by hand, and it still looks good all these years later. And I remember watching in the theater, this is a scene that really impressed me as a kid. And of course I already knew about it beforehand because a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that would be shown on Disney Channel around the time they were talking about this scene in particular, so I already knew it was going to look amazing. But it's different seeing the making of version of it on TV and then seeing it blown up on your movie screen. Now this is a nice one. Mulan touches her hair a lot because the animators noticed that Ming-Na Wen did. It's a nice little, taking a little tick that the actor does and incorporating it into the character. And another little fun thing, this was the first Disney film that was released on DVD in November of '99. I don't believe that's a version of the DVD I have, but nice little bonus thing. Interesting is that Fa Mulan's family name in this film is the Cantonese pronunciation of her name, and I'm not really gonna try pronouncing it, but it's spelled Hua when it's pronounced in Mandarin, and it translates to flower. Now, a fun thing, Ping, the name that Mulan uses it in disguise, translates to flower vase or just vase. And apparently in China, an effeminate male is often called a flower vase or flower pot. So I think they threw that joke in there intentionally for those who might speak Chinese or understood Chinese stuff. And I can imagine that the Chinese audience is probably to get a little kick out of that, or maybe that could be part of the reason they're looking at it like, Westerns. Overall, Mulan, still a very fun, entertaining film, great artistic film. And I mean, even with my little thing about the villainous said, it definitely is still one of my favorites from this era. Just thinking of it without giving too much fault, I'll probably rank it third or fourth. Because the last video in this series is going to be me ranking the films, so you can see how all 10 of them I feel hold up. And who knows, maybe I'll do one on the villains too, that'd be interesting. And of course, after this, we go to the last film in the Disney Renaissance, and of course, it's going to be an ending on an interesting note. It's not going to be a true musical, and that of course is Tarzan. Till then.